My name's Eamon McRaina. I'm an Irish Republican Marxist Leninist from Belfast, and this is my comrade William Morrison. He has his own YouTube channel, which is well worth checking out. We will be discussing the issues of Irish independence, Scottish independence, and multipolarism. And William will have interesting things to say on all those subjects. And as the audience knows, we differ on the subject of Scottish independence. He is from a unionist perspective. I'm from a pro-independence perspective. We will be respectful and civil, and there will be no council mobs. Go ahead, William.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my name's William. I'm a British Marxist Leninist and anti-imperialist based in Scotland. And yeah, it's an honor to be here. I do have my own YouTube channel. It's just called William Morrison. I've got about 170 subscribers. So if you see that channel, that's me. I'd really appreciate you check out my other videos and subscribe. Yeah, I've agreed to be here based to talk about these issues of Irish independence and Scottish independence, because I have a very polarized view on both of them. You know, what I think about Irish independence is pretty much the complete opposite of what I believe about Scottish independence. Yeah, the idea of multipolarism. I come from the international relations background. That's what I specialize in. That's what I'm studying at university. So it's my job to know a lot about multipolarity and unipolarity and the different international institutions of thought and movements and stuff like that. It's my job to know the political activity and the political behavior of sovereign states and the organized political authority of the globe right now, from a national perspective. So that being said, yeah, I just want to add on to what Ian said. We are going to keep it civil, respectful, mature conversation. We might disagree on Scottish independence. That is fine. I'm not a single-minded person. I'm perfectly open to hearing other side points, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot. There's a lot I don't know, and I admit to that. We're not experts in anything. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thanks.
Well, I would counter the thing you said at the end. I would say, in my opinion, that you have expertise on geopolitics and geopolitical strategy.
All right, that's fair. Yeah, okay. But that's it. In regards to political philosophy and political ideology, we can say whatever we want.
Shall we start on the issue of Irish independence then?
Of course, yeah. Please go ahead. This is a subject I don't know a lot about, so I'd really appreciate some background.
Well, we should go back to the start, which is the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, and what were the circumstances that led to this. High King Rory O'Connor deposed the hated King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurrough. This led to Richard de Clare leading an invasion of Ireland in 1167 to support the deposed king, Dermot MacMurrough. This was followed in 1169 by an invading and occupying force led by Henry II. And I would further add, in 1494, Poynan's Law stated that Ireland's Parliament could not meet without the approval of the Royals or the Privy Council. And I'll let you interject here, because I would like to know your opinions on Irish independence and how you came to that conclusion, William.
First of all, just my opinion on it, I'm fully in support of Irish independence. I think that Northern Ireland should be given back to the Republic. I support a socialist, united Ireland under the banner of a working class socialism. Obviously, I was first introduced to the idea of Irish republicanism, or just just Irish nationalism while I studied the IRA. Obviously, there was many movements before that, and like you've just highlighted, you were talking about the 1800s. So Ireland has centuries long history of oppression and colonization and being occupied by foreign forces. So they have a history of very much being the victim of foreign alien oppressors. And so, of course, you'll have resentment. So absolutely, from a historical perspective, I absolutely wholeheartedly support Scottish independence. I got through that, like I said, being introduced to the tactics and the IRA, the provisional IRA to begin with, because they were kind of the Marxist Leninists. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's anyone, not just the IRA. I'm not going to pledge my allegiance to them now. I mean, I don't want this live stream restricted or shadow banned or anything like that. I'll try and keep it subtle, but yeah, they did a hell of a lot, and the people who backed them from an international perspective definitely were, in my opinion, the good guys. Gaddafi, the Ba'athist parties in the Middle East, the Islamic socialist parties in Northern Africa, and then obviously the Warsaw Eastern European Pact of the Soviet Union. The Soviets also massively supported the struggles for Irish independence by giving money to groups like the IRA. And I have nothing against that whatsoever. I think their tactics were absolutely necessary and justified. They had 800 years of oppression and occupation by foreign forces. It's no wonder that the water boiled, into social resentment.
So the backlash was inevitable.
Yeah, it was inevitable. I mean, and even looking at the century that happened in the 1960s, 1970s, that was the year of world conflict. We had World War I, World War II. We had decolonization. We had the British empires, the French empires collapsing. In World War I, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. 3 empires were eradicated because of one global war in World War I. And then in World War II, that was the beginning of the end for the British Empire. And in one country at a time, countries got independence from British colonial rule. So of course, Ireland, as a colonial subject of the British, wanted their independence too. These countries like India and parts of Iran and parts of Syria that were kind of owned by France and Britain, Canada, the Bahamas. There were so many countries out there that were getting independence, and Ireland was so close to the British mainland. Of course, they should have been first on the list for struggling against independence. So I fully support independence, and that's why, pretty much.
To pick up on a couple of subjects that you brought up, you said the 6 counties should be returned to Irish sovereignty, and this is the result of the Ulster Plantation. That was settler colonialism. In 1660, Presbyterians were 20% of Ulster's population and 60% of the British population of Ulster. After 50,000 more were planted, they were an absolute majority in 1720. And between 1650 and 1700, 100,000 Britons were planted in Ulster. And on the provisional IRA being Marxist, well, basically the provisional IRA and the official IRA, which is like the armed wing of the Workers' Party of Ireland, they split from the anti-treaty IRA and anti-treaty Sinn Féin, because in the Tom War, it was just Sinn Féin and the IRA, and that was between 1919 and 1921. But when the Anglo-Irish Treaty was imposed by Westminster, there was a split. Fine Gael went off and became the Free State government, and then a civil war was fought. And then in 1926, Fianna Fáil switched sides and basically recognised the Free State. So It was anti-treaty Sinn Féin and anti-treaty IRA, which continued to refuse to recognise the Free State because it was created by a statute in Westminster, and Westminster has no right to legislate for Ireland. And on the plantation, this was after Cromwell had genocided 600,000 Irish people, as well as sending 100,000 enslaved Irish to the Caribbean. And that's kind of personal for me because when I took my DNA test in 2020, I found out that I had Senegalese ancestry via Barbados.
Really?
So I wonder how that came about. Like Senegal, Scotland, and Ireland, it's quite a distance. But then again, if they're all on the same ship and the same island, that distance gets a lot more proximal. If people would like to use their imaginations.
No, definitely, yeah. Senegal is on like the western coast of Africa, yeah. So from Ireland to there, that's several thousand miles away. Easy. Back in those days, it would have been weeks on a ship to sail there. So that's the
ship just blew off course.
yeah. Very telling, yeah.
And that's not the only thing that cruelty that the British have imposed. There was the forced starvation of 480,000 in the year of slaughter. That's what the Irish called 1740 to 1741. It was a proportionally bigger loss of population for Ireland than from Angora Moor. And that's the Great Famine to people who don't know better. But I could also say R.F. Foster said that 1798 was the most concentrated violence in Irish history. Ulster suffered the most executions. General Lake was untroubled by legal restraint. In the dragooning of Ulster, Ballynahinch was sacked indiscriminately, and over 50,000 Republicans were killed in 1798. But if we dare complain of an Ulster Scots genocide, our rhetoric is being too strong, apparently. And can I ask you, how is this taught in Scotland, in the Scottish education system?
It's not. I knew nothing about any of what you've just said. To be honest, it's not. The Scottish educational curriculum, just we don't get taught about.
So it's just completely whitewashed. It's not just from a pro-British
I'd say the Scottish independence. So Scotland is a devolved power. So the SNP, the Scottish government,
so
have
Holyrood
right over what they teach. They have their own curriculum from England, and as we are ruled by a nationalist party, most of our history that we're taught is just kind of nationalist narratives on history. You know, William the Wallace, stuff like that. The Scottish struggles for independence and stuff. That's kind of what we're taught. Yeah, we're not really taught about the Irish experience under colonialism and British colonialism. We're not really taught about that. So it's a shame that we have to hear it from kind of outside or shady sources, because I mean this happened, you know. Yeah, it's horrible, but yeah, we don't get to answer your question simply. We don't get taught about this. It isn't a question of how it's taught; it's just whether or not we are at all, and we're not. So it's a real shame, because you know you can blame Westminster for that, but education's a devolved power. The SNP has full control over the education system here, and they're teaching us all the wrong things in almost every subject. So it's a real shame.
So Holyrood's taking its cue from imperialists without critical thinking or questioning it? basically. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. I mean, like all countries, we claim to be a democratic society, and lots of people. I'm surprised when I speak to Americans about Scotland. Americans seem to think that Scotland is some sort of like social democratic utopia, like we're somehow like Norway or Sweden, like we're like a social democracy. We're not a social democracy. The SNP was founded, the Scottish National Party, the governing party of Britain, of Scotland,
By overt
was
fascists.
was founded by fascists in 1934. 1934, it was Hitlerite fascists that funded the SNP. They wanted to be the Scottish branch of the National Socialist Party in Germany. They wanted to be when Germany invaded Britain, and when they colonized Scotland. The SNP was there. They wanted to be like an adjourned branch of that kind of party. They were international allies. They were funded by open Nazis. So it's of no surprise that the party that now runs that obviously have came a long way. I'm not calling the SNP fascists. I think their ideology the ideology has clearly changed, but they are still all like they're very right wing nationalists. They don't like immigrants and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean it's no surprise that it's imperialists that influence the education curriculum of what our children are taught. And yeah, we are taught that that the English are evil, the Irish don't matter, and that Scotland is superior to everyone else on the planet, and that our struggles for independence are the most important, and that's the only thing that is worth learning about. If you're Scottish and you go to a Scottish school, that is the only thing that you should spend effort in learning about, the Scottish struggle for independence. The Irish don't matter. Who cares if hundreds of thousands were starved to death and executed and killed for just wanting a little bit of independence? The English are evil, Irish don't matter, and it's Scotland that are the superior people, and we should deserve this is the kind of things that we're taught in our schools.
Over the last 2 years, William, I've been reading a lot of history. Irish history, Scottish history, British history, English history. And basically, without the others, you can't really learn about the history of one. Because Irish, Scottish, British, English, it's all intertwined. And I couldn't believe it when I was reading, particularly the history of Scotland, how much cross-referencing it did with the other histories. And I think without that, you can't teach. Well, if the aim is to teach Scottish history, you can't really do it without the full context. And it's the same with Ireland. This number has been revised down a lot. The death toll of An Gortamore, which is 3 million. I've seen that number revised down to 2.5 million, 2 million, 1.5 million, and now they're revising it down to 1 million. And you're like, you've just reduced that to a third. And another thing, Ireland's population was halved, and it still hasn't recovered to this day. And I bet you that's not taught either.
Yeah, that's insane. How one event in history pretty much halved the Irish population. It's unbelievable. They didn't all die. There was the population of Ireland during the famine was about 3 million, and 1.5 million people are unaccounted for. They were either moved to England or just starved to death or were killed, and it was an absolute mess. It was horrible. There's no other experience in international history where that's been the case, where they half the population in a matter of years. That's a really sobering statistic. And yeah, any attempt to revise or reduce that or downplay that number is absolutely disgusting. It's just reinforcing British colonialism. It's horrible.
But not even that. Imagine that was done to other genocides.
Yeah.
You'd just call it straight out denial and revisionism, and rightly so. It would be like denying the massacre at Glencoe or the clearing of the Crofters. You're just doing it to suit your narrative and suit your narrow ideological ends if you're doing that. And when there were violent Pictish raids or violent raids from Argyll, Strathclyde, you're just trying to make history suit your narrative in the here and now, and it's just immoral and deceitful and dishonest. What would your thoughts be on that?
No, I mean, yeah, I agree. Ireland, there's a famous quote that everybody knows, that history is written by the victors. Whoever wins something usually gets to write what actually happened, completely disregarding of the loser's perspective. And if you apply Marxian kind of dialectical and historical materialism to that, you can see that we shouldn't be thinking about this as a national thing. It's a class thing. And the losers are always the oppressed and labouring classes in any mode of production. It doesn't matter if it's slavery, the feudal system with the serfs, and now modern day capitalism. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what countries win wars. It's always the people that lose in each of those countries. It's always a class thing. And you can talk about intersectionality, but I really do think that class is the primary contradiction. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you that history is just this. It's a difficult thing. Nobody really knows the truth because it's written by so big liars. And of course, whoever wins wars or whoever wins historical events are just that side that has the most resources, material resources, to have won in the first place. And if they have the resources to win a war, then of course they have the resources to completely rewrite history of what actually happened. It's horrible. So yeah, I mean, history is written by the victors, and the victors are never the actual people, the actual working class of any country. We are always the ones that lose.
On resources, winning wars, and the working class always suffering. The British Empire in 1870 had a quarter of the world's gross domestic product, and in the 1910s, just before the Dublin lockout by James Connolly, and then 1916, Dublin had the highest poverty rate, not only in Ireland, not only in just what was called the United Kingdom, but the whole British Empire. And I'm not saying the streets of India were great either. I am not saying that, but I'm just saying this is how sharp and pervasive the effects of imperialism is on the lumpen proletariat, which would have been the people in the tenements of Dublin.
Yeah, that's crazy. I didn't know that either. That's actually crazy. So, of all of the places occupied by British rule, the Irish had the highest poverty rates of any other colonized area, statistically.
Yes, and
yeah,
that's not downplaying what happened in India and Bangladesh, because basically where British imperialism went, poverty and suffering were sure to follow, because that's the cost of doing business and making a surplus and a profit. That's why Vladimir Lenin said imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. He also said that the Irish Citizens' Army was the first Red Army that the world had ever seen.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Lenin spoke very highly of the Irish struggle for independence. He spoke very highly. He was hugely supportive of the Irish struggle. He was very consistent in advocating for the Irish. Yeah, but it's the general material conditions of the British Empire were brutal. Just from recently during the war, when India at first refused to join World War One, Churchill just went out and ordered a blockade of a major city, starving 4 million people. 4 million people, mostly women and children, were just starved to death because Churchill had ordered a blockade. And just to mention, it was actually a Scottish battalion that enforced that law. It was Irish people that had that were over there overseeing that in Ireland, in India, and yeah, it was them that oversaw and enforced the starvation of that 4 million people in India, and that's a estimated number. Numbers for that genocide go up to high as 8 million and go as low as 1 million. But I mean, it's in the millions. And yeah, it was a Scottish battalion that oversaw it. But yeah, those are the kind of things that happened under the British Empire. Just that was normal. Like, you're the subservient, subject of the Great Britain. Or if you go against us or don't do as we say, we'll starve millions of your people.
I think. Do you not think so?
Sorry, what did you say?
Is Churchill's grade made it easier for him to dehumanize millions of people, and I personally think even 8 million seems like a low estimate, even though it was the high end there.
Yeah, oh yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, cities in India, even India back in the 1940s, the population of major cities were in the tens of millions. It's very possible that it was the death count for that specific genocide was over 8 million. I can very easily clearly see how that could be the case. Yeah, for sure. Like I said, history is written by the victors and whoever has the most material resources, and obviously it was British. So even when the British admitted that they'd done it, they probably had they thought that they had the right to like downplay and just lie about the facts because they could who's going to stop them? They could just lie about stuff like that. So there's probably lots of atrocities and genocides and crusades that the British have taken part in where they just all out lied about the counts of the people that they'd killed because they couldn't be bothered to actually count and know because they didn't even care, or they knew that they'd fucked up and they had to downplay it. But who was going to stop them? Like, it's just they didn't care. It was a complete disregard for human value, for human life, for human decency. Just a complete disregard. The British Empire represents the worst in all civilizations anywhere on the planet. It's just it's brutal. The history of it is just dehumanizing entire civilizations, casual racism, just grinding people to absolute desolation. Sorry?
I'd argue it wasn't casual.
Well, no, no. It was systematic. It was ingrained in their policy and in their laws. They were quite open about the fact that they thought that certain races were just inferior animal savages, and that some were superior. Yeah, they were quite open about that.
I think they were rationalizing their greed, and you've reminded me of a couple of things. You said about basically they could get away with it. Well, they had a quarter of the world's resources, as I said at one point, like the Roman Empire had back in the day. And basically remember that the Roman Empire's judiciary was the Roman imperial civil magistrate, which had the fasces. Symbol.
Yeah.
Basically, I would argue that you said the British Empire collapsed earlier on and the French Empire collapsed, but I would argue that they're still there, and especially the British Empire, because you can call it the Commonwealth of Nations and have strict free trade rules if you like, but everyone can see what it is, basically. And can I say a couple of things before we get on the subject of Scotland?
Yeah, sure.
On part of my notes I have here on why Ireland deserves independence, there are 100 million Irish people in the world, and 88% of Irish people retain the genetic markers of the first settlers, and hunter-gatherers and caribou, there is evidence that they lived in Ireland 33,000 years ago. That makes Ireland an ancient civilization, relatively. And I would say that Lornians came to Ireland as they saw Antrim's hills from Caledonia, and you know where that is.
Yeah.
And the origins of the Irish show that there are pre-Aryan words of Afro-Asiatic origin in the Irish Gaelic language. This means the Irish have been speaking their language throughout their existence. I thought they were interesting facts to put forward, even though it doesn't say much about the material conditions of the Irish, which I would argue that despite not being what they should be, though you could say the same thing about Scotland, they have improved with Christianity. And with the rise of the right-wing nationalists in the SNP, Scotland's got less religious and the material conditions have worsened. But can I ask you to explain, even though you did a great video on it, on why you take a unionist position on Scottish independence?
You just want me to reiterate like why I think that Scotland should remain part of the UK.
If you could summarise it, and for those in the audience who have not seen it, I would recommend going to William's channel and watching it.
Yeah, please do. The video is called I can't even remember. It's something like 3 reasons why I don't support Scottish independence or something. But there's many more I have that I don't support Scottish independence. But the main one is that the class history of the relationship between Scotland and England, ever since the trade union movement and the socialist movement began. I mean, Ian already knows what I'm going to say, but we've always had a sense of solidarity and comradeship with the English. That's been a sense, not from a colonial perspective. I'm not talking about colonialism here. I'm just talking about the trade union movement, the socialist movement, a working class grassroots movement. There's always been a sense of solidarity between the Scottish and communist, Scottish and English workers. From Red Clydeside, when I think it was 1919, there was massive industrial strikes, general strikes in Glasgow. Hundreds of thousands of workers went on strike. Women joined in the strikes and refused to pay rent and stuff like that. There was very violent clashes with the police. And what happened was that the English actually locked the Scottish soldiers in their barracks in case they sympathised with the Scottish, the Scottish peasants revolting. Sent in troops. England sent troops into Glasgow to put down the unrest because the strike got so out of hand. But this isn't a story about England oppressing Scotland like the nationalists would have you believe. Actually, this was the start of an entire movement all over the UK. And workers in England were inspired by Red Clydeside and also went on strike too. So actually, it got so bad that the tanks actually had to leave Glasgow because it got worse in other places in England because workers had been inspired by Red Clydeside and the Scottish workers rising up. And, all over England, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, London, Sheffield, with the steel factories, they were all going on strike. Nobody was working. Production plummeted within that couple of weeks where it happened. And there was hundreds of arrests. There was I don't know the specific number for how many people were killed and stuff. I don't think it was that many, to be fair, but it was very violent, and it was a symbol that rippled through the entire of the British Empire, which was we stand united as a class. We are the oppressed class from an international perspective. And there's always been a sense, and during the Thatcher era, when Margaret Thatcher was outsourcing jobs and deindustrializing Britain and sending all of our good paying jobs over to developing countries to pay them workers less money to make even more profits. Hundreds of thousands of people were getting laid off every month in Scotland, England and Wales. And it was very, very difficult times. Even here in Dundee, we had rates of about 40% unemployment rates in Dundee during the 1980s. I think mass, like that's a huge number. Even nowadays, we talk about like the Spanish unemployment rates. They're about 25%. Like we were 40 back then. Huge unemployment rates. It was almost impossible to find a job. That's because massive factories were just sent to Bangladesh or Indonesia or Vietnam. So yeah, massive strikes happened. I think they started in Wales and England, the miners' strike, when the mines were threatened to go on strike and eventually did. And there was hundreds of thousands of of workers all over Scotland, England, and Wales going on strike together. They were all marching under the banner, the red banner of socialism, and those were the good times. Those were the golden age of the communist movement here in Britain. Absolutely fantastic stuff happening. Welsh workers were getting on buses to England, and English workers were getting on buses to Scotland to join in strikes there, and Scottish workers were going down to England to join in picket lines there when the police were being too harsh in Scotland. And it was a network of supporting each other. No matter, we didn't care if they were English or Welsh. They were workers, and they were facing getting laid off. They were facing losing their job, losing their livelihood, losing the ability to feed their family. I know the whole idea of a family is quite a controversial issue, but I completely am fine with the traditional idea of the value of the family. I think it's a good thing that all communists should be okay. Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with the traditional family, and that's what they were. That was the heart of the issue when the miners' strike were happening. These workers were not going to be able to feed their families. These male workers were working impossibly difficult hours, getting almost no money, but still being able to feed their family and have food on the plate. And for the first time in lots of those people's lives, that was becoming increasingly difficult to do. And so it didn't matter, we won't support them because they're English, or we won't support them because they're Welsh, and they're just all alcoholics, and all Scottish people are all drunken alcoholics who'll fight you for no reason. Like, we didn't care about those stereotypes. We supported each other because this was a family matter. Families were losing income, and they couldn't feed their children, and they couldn't send their children to school, and it was disgusting conditions. So all throughout British history, recent British history, there's been a sense of solidarity. And I don't believe for 1 minute that solidarity is through coercion or influence or force or control or intimidation by Westminster. I think that it's a mutual understanding that, yes, we have national differences or ethnic differences, because my next point is that Scotland isn't even a nation to begin with. But we have ethnic differences. But that doesn't matter. We are a class. Welsh workers have more in common with Scottish workers than the Welsh do with their own ruling class. We are one class, united. So moving on to my next point is that there is no Scottish nation. Scotland isn't a country any more than England is a country. And I refer to the Marxism and the National Question. If anyone's read that pamphlet, there's a criteria. It's not a relatively strict criteria, but there are criteria there that kind of tell Marxists whether or not something is a country or not. And I don't see from that pamphlet how Scotland can be a nation. Well, for starters, Scotland and England, the geographical territories of Scotland and England, have been occupied by different people. Scotland has huge historical influences from the Vikings. We were raided by Vikings. We weren't ever occupied by the Romans. The Romans didn't come to us. And the nationalists, the Scottish nationalists, will have you believe that the reason why the Romans didn't conquer Scotland was because we were too strong and we scared them away. That's not true at all. The Romans never attempted to invade or occupy Scotland. We didn't have the resources. They had no interest in occupying Scotland. We had nothing that they wanted. England had fresh canals with fresh water. They had massive overseas territory that had already had networking done. They had docks, they had trading, they had whole infrastructures there that the Romans could just take over. Scotland, infrastructurally, we were lacking behind by a lot. The Romans didn't want. Can you want something to say?
Did Agricola not record battles between the Caledonians and the Romans and the Picts and the Romans before Antonine's Wall or Hadrian's Wall was put up?
Yeah, you did. Yeah, there was clashes between the Caledonians and the Romans for sure. But honestly, I don't see any historical evidence. If you have any, please do. Like I said at the start, I'm very open-minded.
They ever occupied, but they did fight, and that was the point of Antonine's Wall and then Hadrian's Wall, to serve as a defence from the Caledonian and Pictish kingdoms.
Yeah. But my main point is that the nationalists here in Scotland would tell you that the reason that the Romans didn't ever manage to occupy us because we were all scary big clansmen who fought them and ran them off to the hills back to England. That isn't true. There was clashes, yeah, for sure. But I doubt very much that it was over resources. I don't know what resources the Romans would have wanted from Scotland. We had almost nothing. We had Highlands and the Lowlands. The Lowlands had the main job. So even back then, we didn't even have the infrastructure back then to even divide those two. So we had nothing really. We lived in clans back then. In the Highlands, we had mud huts. I really can't see any economic or material interests the Romans would have had. But yeah, for sure, we had clashes with them. We had wars with the Romans.
Call back there. So you have the British history. Caradicus, I think it was, in his defence in the Roman Senate for having rebelled on behalf of the Britons against the Romans. He says, with all your lovely villas and mansions, why do you envy our mud huts? And it's a great point about material conditions. And that brings me up to another question I wanted to ask you. What are the material conditions of places like Govan, the Gorbals, the shipyards, and the mining towns in northern England and in Wales today compared to what they were? And they weren't great during the Thatcher era or the times when there were strikes in the 20th century.
Well, I mean, we can see now, if you walk down any of these places, high streets, they're desolate buildings. They're pretty much they've been decayed and completely neglected for decades. There's been no investment into these communities and into these areas, and they've just been kind of left desolate. Even here in Dundee, we had major factories and we had mines here. And if you look down the high street in say Lochee or Minas Hill, which are like kind of the schemes in Dundee, there's nothing there. There's boarded up shops, there's graffiti, there's broken shattered windows. That's the same in Northern England too, the major mining towns in Northern England, the Midlands and stuff. You walk down these high streets and there's just been years of decay. There's graffiti, there's smashed up windows, there's boarded up shops. There's almost no investment. Like, it's really depressing actually to see. Before Thatcher did what she did, these were thriving towns with massive economic output. They were making money. They were providing for families, like we talked about before. Good things were happening. It was the golden age economically in Britain, the 1960s, 70s. These were good times, comparatively to other times. Those were one of the better times. And even people who are alive today in Britain will tell you, 60s, 70s, wasn't the worst years that people have gone through in Britain, mainland Britain. But you see now after the outsourcing of jobs and after the Thatcherite era, these places have been left desolate. The material conditions are just awful. There's high crime rates, there's high incarceration rates, very low reoffending rates. Very high reoffending rates. Austerity has taken its toll. There's shops closing down all the time. Unemployment and poverty are higher in those areas than anywhere else in Britain currently right now today. It's a shit situation for a lot of people, and a lot of people are just giving up and leaving the town that they were brought up in. These people might have been born and bred in these places, and they're just getting up and leaving because there's nothing there for them now. It's a decaying.
I can understand high streets. Why Brexit happened against such a backdrop of poverty in Northern England, which was something that Engels was writing about. And do you want to outline your third objection to Scottish independence from the video we spoke about before I make my case for Scottish independence?
Yeah, sure. Well, pretty much my third point that I'd make now, the video I made was quite a while away. The the third video I'd make up now is just that, like, Scottish material conditions have worsened under a devolved Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament, the Scottish government has had their opportunity to improve conditions for the people. They have massive. Scotland is pretty much an independent nation. We have Devo Max now. We have maximum devolution, pretty much. We don't have control over the military or immigration, stuff like that. But we fund our own hospitals now. We fund our own prison system. We have our own separate police forces. We have our own banks. We have our own currency to a certain extent. We have the Scottish banknotes that you can't use in England. A lot of English places don't accept Scottish notes because they think it's some sort of fraud. We have our own institutions.
Scottish notes in Ireland here.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
But you can't use Irish or Scottish notes in England.
There's actually a crime against it.
It frustrates me.
Yeah,
but go ahead.
Yeah, essentially, material conditions have worsened even under. The Scottish Parliament was set up in, I believe, 1997, and so they've had decades to improve the education system, the healthcare system, the prison system, public transport, and they haven't. My city, Dundee, we are the drug death capital of Europe. The entirety of Europe, the city that I live in right now, is the drug death capital. We have the most deaths from drugs per capita than any other place in Europe. We're also the highest rates of teenage pregnancy in Europe. We're the teenage pregnancy capital of Europe. Dundee, not Scotland, Dundee, this city. There are more people per capita.
Is it heroin causing the premature deaths?
Heroin is a huge problem, yeah. Heroin is one of the biggest killers in Scotland in regards to drugs, for sure. So yeah, there's huge problems. These are massive social problems. Knife crime is not just a problem reserved to England. Glasgow and Edinburgh have their fair share of knife attacks every year, and it's getting worse because
they used to call Glasgow Belfast without the bullets.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, Glasgow's always been a volatile and polarized place culturally and socially. That's definitely very true. It's a good analogy. But yeah, I mean, my point is the SNP, which, like I said previously, is a party that was funded by Nazis, Hitlerite fascists in 1934. Obviously, their ideological foundation has changed, but they are still right-wing nationalists who openly and quite proudly spread hate against the English workers too. I mean, yeah, you can say whatever you want about the English ruling class. That's fine. I'll join you in that. I'll join you in advocating for the abolishment of the royal family. I don't want anything to do. I want them abolished. I'd have them lined up if it was up to me. That's not the Britishness that I'm trying to advocate here. There are two different kinds of patriotism in every single country on the planet. There's working class proletarian patriotism, and then there's super patriotism by the ruling class. And by the definition of what patriotism actually is, it should be communists that are the most patriotic people in society. And the government, like the Tories here, the Conservatives, they will claim to be we're patriotic, we love our country. They don't love our country. If they loved the country and the people that they seem to occupy and reign over, they'd look after us. Because we are British, they should look after us. We have a shared national identity. But they don't. They could give a shit. They would rather sell us out to private foreign investment and private companies. They'd rather send us off to war to die for oil and natural resources, for geopolitical agendas that have absolutely nothing to do with the interests of the working class. Communists are the true patriots in every single country. We should be patriotic about our history and our country and our people and our land and our soil. So there are two different kinds of patriotism. And yeah, if Scottish people want to be patriotic, that's fine. But I see Scottish communists all the time here in Scotland who vote SNP because they think the SNP are the best party to give Scotland the independence, the socialist Scottish republic that they think that's not true at all. The SNP is still a party of the bourgeoisie. It's a bourgeois ruling class party. It represents bourgeois interests, and material conditions have consistently and constantly deteriorated year after year under SNP devolved power. we're no better than England in regards to that. And actually, in regards to imperialism, a lot of nationalists will say, "Oh well, we'll weaken British imperialism." I don't see how that is true at all. We would be unifying the British ruling class with a Scottish and an independent Scotland, but weakening the voice of the British working class. Like I said, we have had centuries of solidarity and comradeship with English and Scottish and Welsh workers. And if Scotland was to become independent, we'd be turning our backs on all of the progress that we've made in these institutions with the English and Welsh workers. We'd be leaving them behind. And I don't even think we'd be leaving them behind, because I don't think Scotland would be better as an independent nation. I don't see how Scotland being an independent country would weaken. It might weaken British imperialism, but it won't weaken international imperialism. It would create yet another imperialist state. If you look at the SNP's foreign policy, they are more imperialist than Westminster. If Nicola Sturgeon was the PM, if Nicola Sturgeon, the first Prime Minister of Scotland, if she was in charge of Britain, she would have troops in Ukraine right now fighting against the Russians. She would have Scottish troops marching through Aleppo, killing Syrians. She would want troops in Taiwan to deter China from retaking its own land. English ministers have never even mentioned anything about intervening militarily in Taiwan. This is the radical hysteria that the SNP are spouting, and they think that this is good. They think that this is popular. This is not popular. The SNP, from a foreign policy perspective, are more imperialist than the English. So I'm sorry, but I don't think that would weaken imperialism. It might weaken British imperialism, but British imperialism is connected to the wider network of international imperialism, US-led, hegemonic, parasitical, monopolistic unipolarism, and Scottish independence would not help the working class internationally. It would assist in the further repression and retrograde conditions of the working class internationally. So, yeah, that's me. That's my rant over.
My counter argument would be that you don't need the SNP or Anglophobia or deteriorating material conditions for an independent Scotland. And if it really was an independent Scotland, it would also be independent of the EU and international imperialism. I would argue that the British workers are not united against the British establishment, and that uniting Scottish workers against the Scottish establishment is more achievable. I would say that Scotland never votes for the Conservatives, but is always governed by the Conservatives. And I would argue that you would say it's Steve O'Max. I would argue that the vow was broken and that the Tories, Labour, Lib Dems never had any intention of giving the full powers to Holyrood. And from what you're describing on the material front, maybe it's just as well. They might have just screwed that up as well. And it's the SNP, given the incompetence they have shown, they might have screwed it up, but that doesn't exclude the possibility of a pro-working Scottish government ever coming to power in Holyrood. I would say Project Fear was the strategy of the No campaign, and it was supported by the establishment. If it was a divide and conquer among the workers' strategy, why would they support the campaign against it? And I would say that better together is a lie, as all those bad things you rightly identified Holyrood doing it. They did it under the auspices of and with the blessing of the Westminster government. So much for better together on that. I would argue that Scotland is self-sufficient in hydrocarbons. It possesses the world's biggest oil field in the North Sea, and the North Sea profits are at a record high. Imagine if you redistributed that to the people in Govan, the Gorbals, and the shipyards, or even the Dundee. It could revolutionise the working class majority, basically. Scottish people are of Scottish and Pictish descent, so I would argue that it does form a separate cohesive nation compared to the other British nations, and they have had a separate culture since the Iron Age, and Gaelic and Scots are the spoken languages of Scotland, as Gaelic and Scots are spoken languages in Ireland. So there's that similarity. And Pictish coins show Scottish economic independence in history. And another difference is English people have half the Irish ancestry that Scots do, and that the Dark Age Scottish genetic markers are still intact with the people of Scotland today. Would you like to come back on that before we speak of multipolarism?
Yeah, sure. Just quickly, yeah, I do want to talk about multipolarism, and as we're reaching about an hour mark, so yeah, sure, I'll give you just a real rebuttal. A lot of your argument about Irish and Scottish experiences are a lot about genealogy and ancestry, about like the history, not just the history. The history is important, obviously, but you have like a specific interest in like the genealogy of people and like the ethnicity and the ancestry. And I just want to ask, like, to what extent do you think that that's important to nowadays material conditions? Like you said before, that like there's about 100 million Irish people in the world. Well, obviously, the population of nowadays Ireland, even if it was unified, would be less than 10 million, I think. So to what extent do you think that genealogy and ancestry is actually important nowadays? And also, you say that we don't need an SNP to get independence, and that's fine. Like if you want like an armed like Scottish Socialist Republican group, that's fine. You know, you can try it that way too. I'd caution against it. Well, that's fine. But like, I just want to say, like, you know, we do live in a bourgeois national democratic society, and you know, I just want to know, if not the SNP, because a lot of communists like us in Scotland vote for the SNP because they think that it's true. So are they wrong to do that? And what's the alternative to the SNP? And also, the Conservative Party is the second biggest party in Scotland. So everyone talks about how independence is some sort of mass movement, and that everybody in Scotland wants it, and that everybody in Scotland wants freedom from the bad English. But actually, I mean, in 2014, the No won, the Better Together campaign won, by a very small minority. I'll give you that. It was very, very close, and I think I even admit it myself, as somebody that does class myself as British and doesn't want independence for Scotland. I do think that in October 2023, when we have the second independence referendum, the yes will win. I do think that Scotland will be an independent nation. Yeah, I don't want it, and I will campaign for the no, but I think it's going to happen. A lot's changed in the past 9 years. Well, yeah, I just want to know, like, if not the SNP, which obviously if the yes do win next year, it would be them to run an independent. And I've already talked about the open and proud racism and Anglophobia that they've espoused, the hate crimes that they've helped spark and heat up, and the hate crime bill. These are the most liberal, woke people you'll ever meet on the planet from a domestic perspective.
Apart from
Britain, Britain introduced the hate blood crime, and pretty much every other place rejected it. Scotland, no. Flying colours, they passed the courts. We now have a hate blood crime. You can't say certain things. Scotland is the only country in Britain right now that you're compelled to not say certain things. And I'm at university, and I know people at university that have been kicked off their course for even questioning the trans ideology. I've had people in my course that's been kicked off their course saying, "No, you can't. You're done. Like, you can't be a university student anymore." They've lost their privilege and their seat at the course for even questioning stuff regarding the LGBT or the trans related questions. And that's fair enough. Well, sorry, it's not fair enough. That's absolutely abhorrent. But that doesn't happen in England. I have comrades in England that I'm very close to. That doesn't happen. You still have that little leeway. So actually, you can talk about how bad the English are, but Scotland is becoming more fascistic more quickly than England is, to the point where people can't have education. And just
Can I address your point and answer your questions, sir?
yeah, no worries. Yeah, that was pretty much be that.
But basically, I think there is a need for a pro-independence Marxist Leninist party, as instead of a party like the SNP, ALBA, or the Green Party. And on the hate crimes bill, so criticizing gender ideology, that's beyond acceptability, but Anglophobia is fine. I don't see how that's consistent and how that would be a strong basis to build a future Scotland and improve material conditions of the working class in Scotland. It seems paradoxical and self-contradictory.
This is one of the things that I'm worried about if Scotland does become independent, because that is the ideological path that we're going down. England isn't. England is sticking to its quite conservative roots, in that it doesn't, it isn't really fully supportive of that. The English working class, the Scottish working class, whether or not they're doing it themselves or they're being dragged by the ruling class, but we are being forced to say these certain things and support certain things that we might not support. And hell, even if we ask certain questions, even if we want to know a little bit about what's actually happening, if we actually genuinely ask for scientific explanations. So that's one of the things that I'm scared about. This is the path that we're going down. We're not even independent yet, and this is what the SNP has done. They have compelled speech. They've imprisoned people for making jokes that are racist or transphobic. They've deplatformed people. They've sacked and recalled public ministers who have said the most basic, this is the most slightly kind of questionable stuff. It's unbelievable. This law is absolutely crazy.
So you can say something innocuous and end up in jail.
Pretty much, yeah. There's been people that have been arrested. I don't know if that person it went viral. I don't know. It was a couple of years ago, but it was the Glaswegian guy who taught his dog to see Kyle, and it's like,
Paul. Yeah, I did.
Yeah, I said, oh, do you want to?
Mike Machin, was it?
Yeah, he was sent to jail. He was sent for 2 years, 1 year on parole, and he had to pay like a 10 grand fine, £10,000 fine. It was a joke. It was a cute dog doing a horrible thing regarding the Nazis. It was a fucking joke. Someone
got offended on the internet. That's what that was.
Yeah, and that's all. It's absolute hysteria, and this is the direction that Scottish society is going down, and I want absolutely nothing to do with it. So if the English working class can give us some sort of fucking normality, then that's fine. I want to stick with that. I want to stick with the normality of the working class, not go absolutely hysterical over the slightest thing.
Before we tackle the issue of multipolarism, on Tories being the second biggest group, since
I'm still here.
Oh yeah, since the noughties, it's been all SNP, but before that, it was solidly Labour for decades, and that's what I meant when I say most of the Scottish people are against Conservatives, even though there is a significant bloc in Holyrood.
No, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Labour obviously still is a massive party. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, Labour, the thing is, Scotland and England have different electoral systems, so it's extremely difficult. Obviously, general elections have first past the post, and Scottish elections have AMS. We have the additional member system. So it is difficult to kind of translate that into one kind of centralised system. But, I mean, yeah, generally, nationally, over Scotland, through the share of votes, the Conservatives are the second biggest. But yeah, I mean, even in constituencies like Dundee, the Labour is the second biggest party in Dundee. And I think that's the same for Glasgow and Edinburgh, which are the major cities in Scotland. It's more like the rural agricultural areas. Arbroath, Aberdeen, the Westlands, West Coast, and up north, there are lots of fishing towns and stuff. They vote Conservative because they believe that the Conservative Party has their interests best at heart. But no, yeah, I mean, yeah. So yeah, I definitely see your point, and yeah, that makes sense to me.
And moving on to multipolarism, what are your thoughts on over 100 countries using Chinese currency in international payments and Chinese currency being the 8th most traded on the planet?
I think it's fantastic. Not only because I support China, but because it gives countries a second option. China is strong enough now to take on the US through a economic kind of not conflict, but a race kind of. It's a race to the top now. The last time we had kind of bipolarism from a kind of international relations perspective was during the Cold War. We have hegemony or unipolarism, which is just one country dominating the world, which is what we have now with the US, and we've had that since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then during the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, we had bipolarism, which is countries had an option to choose who they wanted to side with. You sided with the Soviets or you sided with the US. And we haven't had that choice in a very, very long time. And now, all of a sudden, with the rise of China, okay, it isn't the Soviet Union anymore, but it's a second choice now. This is the rise of not only bipolarism, but multipolarism. Because it's not just China versus the US. Brazil wants a little bit piece of the pie. Russia wants a little piece of the pie. Iran is rising in the Middle East. And all these countries, okay, except from Brazil. Brazil is quite they're different. But the other 4 countries I mentioned, Iran, Russia, China, and even like Pakistan and stuff, Pakistan are rising. They all have similar interests in that they vehemently oppose the US and what they do around the world. And if the bloc is building, and it's super interesting to see that just a couple of years ago, countries were too scared to show support to China. They were too scared to even trade with China because the US would sanction them or blockade them. Now countries don't care. The US on an international scale is drastically losing its influence on the world. And countries are caring less about the ramifications of their support to China, and they're just doing it anyway. The Solomon Islands recently passed a bill, and it just shows how island nations are affected. Island nations 5 years ago would never have even bothered to even mention support to China because they'd be too scared. Like the Maldives, the Seychelles, Mauritius, the Micronesia, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, they would be terrified to admit support to China because the US was dominating them. Now, 5 years on, they couldn't give a shit. Just, I think 3 weeks ago, the Solomon Island passed a bill in their parliament that said that China would now be responsible for 75% of that country's import, which means, and it used to be America before. So they've changed hands now. Most of the trade that the Solomon Islands get is with China now, not with the US anymore. And as long as that keeps on happening in that trajectory, then I'm very much supportive of it. And you said over 100 countries are now using Chinese currency and trading with China, and the US can't do anything. They don't have a leg to stand on. They're losing support rapidly, and China is gaining support rapidly. And that isn't through force or intimidation. That's because China is genuinely helping countries in Africa and the Middle East. Their infrastructure programs, their investments in local communities in Africa. They've built roads and railways and hospitals in Africa. They don't expect any of that money back. They just wanted to help people because Africa has experienced centuries of European colonization. They've been completely oversaturated with oppression, and naturally they can't even grow their own stuff now. And there's a famous quote, obviously, Africa isn't poor, not in resources, they're just overexploited. If they controlled and owned and regulated their own resources and their own land, they would be incredibly rich because they'd actually do it with national interests. They wouldn't be selling themselves out to private imperialist capitalist industries. So yeah, they countries are not supporting China because they're being forced to, like the Western media will have you believe, is because they actually are seeing firsthand that China is helping them and actually wants to help as a humanitarian mission. Just like during the COVID pandemic, when Cuba sent medical brigades, when the US were sending bombs to Syria and bombing Palestine and Syria and killed Qasem Soleimani, the military minister, the defense minister of Iran, Cuba were sending military brigades to Africa to help with the outbreaks of the COVID pandemic. Very different brigades. The US were sending military brigades, where Cuba and Vietnam were going on lockdown. Well, that's controversial, but they were helping their people one way or another. So yeah, China isn't the bad guy anymore. And communists have obviously been saying that for a very, very long time, but now even normal, apolitical people who are not even really that interested in politics, are saying, yeah, maybe China isn't bad. Maybe we should give them a little here. Maybe we should hear them out. And as long as that keeps on happening, full support. But it isn't just China. Multipolarism doesn't mean just China. If it was just China and the US, it would be bipolarism. That isn't what this is. This is multipolarism. This is more than 3 countries gaining influence in different spheres. And just one more thing before I let him speak. I know I spoke for a while. Communists and anyone needs to stop being scared of using the word multipolarist. I know that the term multipolarism can be connected to Alexander Dugin, and I know in communist spaces, he's a very controversial figure. He's a Nazbol or whatever. He was the founder of the Russian Nazbol party. But nowadays in the 2022, he's a geopolitical advisor to Putin. He works in the Russian government. He's a geopolitical advisor. So actually, it doesn't actually matter what you think of his philosophy. I'm not a National Bolshevik, and I've read the National Bolshevik Manifesto by Karl Otto Peitel in the 1920s, and I've read lots of works by Dugin. I've got some on my bookshelf. I've got the Fourth Political Ideology and stuff. I've read it. Yeah, it is what it is. It's very interesting. It's opened my eyes to certain things. I don't necessarily support it. There's a lot I don't like. But stop being scared, okay? I'm not going to stop saying the word multipolar or multipolarism because of some beef I have with Dugin. I don't really care about that. Multipolarism has always been language that people in the international relations and political sciences have used, and we're not going to stop saying that because we're scared to be associated with a certain ideology. So yeah, don't be scared. Stop it. Say whatever you want. Language is different to politics. So just stop thinking about what words are connected to certain ideologies and just say what you actually think, please.
I was going to say on the multipolarism, the reason I brought up over 100 countries trading in Chinese currency, because that leads me on to my next point, and you actually covered a lot of what I wanted to talk about there. There's 43 countries that are hostile to Russia are now compelled to trade with Russia in rubles. That's another good sign against the petrodollar. And trade with Russia, Pakistan, and Africa will strengthen China's currency in international trades. I'll give you a few examples here. $9.5 trillion worth of trade is done on the Belt Road, and the Belt Road generates $28.4 trillion in gross domestic product. And China's trade surplus is $101 billion. Russia's is $70 billion. Compare this with the United States, $79.6 billion, Britain, $35.2 billion, and the EU, $12.6 billion. And when you do the accumulative totals between the respective blocks, 2 countries, $171 billion is greater than $127.4 billion of the other 3 blocks. And that shows you which way the winds are shifting and where the trade and productivity is shifting towards. What would be your opinion on that? Again,
very good. For sure. I mean, even people who are not interested in politics are now seeing maybe it is time for a new world leader. And even I was speaking to my dad today. He's not even interested in politics. He couldn't care less. He's very apolitical. But he was talking about, the rise of China, and he was asking me some questions because he knows that I know that it's kind of my area. And I kind of gave him like a 5-minute explanation, and he just did it like, maybe it's time to give somebody else a chance to rule the world. Maybe it's time to maybe shift away from the US. They've had their chance and they fucked it up over and over again, every year almost. Since World War II, the US has tried to overthrow over 50 foreign governments for no apparent reason other than just to for America's own geopolitical agenda. So yeah, maybe it's time. Even people who are not political are waking up to the fact that maybe it's time to let another country take the reins for a while, just to see how it goes. And I mean, I can promise you, if that country is China, then things will get better very, very fast. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned the countries. 45. Do you say 45 countries about the Russia thing?
43
used to be hostile to Russia.
No, they are hostile, so they
are
must.
hostile, but they have been compelled to trade in rubles.
Yeah, if the US or Britain, the EU, you just want to buy oil and gas, pay up in rubles. You can't trade in the petrodollar anymore because Putin did not like the escalation against Russia in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a countermeasure.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely justified. It's hilarious, actually. It's a shot in the foot to the imperialists because they all thought all this sanctioning, that Rishi Sunak, a candidate for the prime minister for Britain, he thinks that sanctions are going to scare off Russia. And that's been the response from the West from the whole outbreak of this conflict. Oh, let's just sanction them. Let's sanction some oligarchs and let's seize some assets. And yeah, I mean, the Russian economy took a dip in the first couple of weeks of the conflict, sure, because they had to adjust to their new system. But Russia are doing perfectly fine now. They're pretty much back to normal economically. In fact, they're doing better. And they've made friends and allies with countries that they never would have otherwise if they weren't sanctioned. Countries like Djibouti and Ethiopia and Somalia and Algeria and Morocco. These countries were fairly neutral. They didn't really care about Russia to begin with. But now that Russia have been forced to go to look elsewhere for kind of trade markets, these countries have started kind of opening up to Russia. And like you said, I think some of those countries I mentioned are a part of that 45 that were actually quite hostile and have been forced to pay in rubles. And just to show the world what happens when you don't pay up in rubles, I think one of the Baltic countries, I can't remember if it was Estonia or Latvia.
It was Latvia.
Latvia. Yeah. No, they got their energy cut off. They refused to pay in rubles. They were like, hell no, we're not paying in rubles. We love the USA so much. We love imperialism. The EU, the NATO is going to back us. And they didn't. Russia cut off their energy supply for a good while because they refused to pay in energy. And that was their whole country fucked. So that's what happens when you side with the imperial.
In the Horn of Africa, you were talking about Somalia and Ethiopia. I think this shows the difference between the American approach to nations and the Chinese approach. The Americans are doing a regime change war in Somalia for Somalia's lithium, and they're doing a brutal regime change war against Ethiopia by arming the TPLF.
Yeah,
and they're doing that for Ethiopia's gold, silver, and potash. Mm-hmm. Whereas you look at the Chinese approach to Ethiopia, the Chinese Foreign Ministry a few days ago was boasting about the plane loads of goods and produce going towards Ethiopia from China.
Yeah.
And that just shows you the world of difference.
Yeah.
And this is why there are multi-poles emerging and ascending now, as you pointed out.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. It just shows the difference in geopolitical strategies. We've had decades, centuries of Western imperialist countries, doing regime changes. Oh, if they don't like something in some shithole country, as Trump would put it, that we can just do a regime change. We're America, we're number one, we're the best, we're the strongest, blah blah blah. There's nothing that anyone can do to stop us. We don't like something that's happening. We can just thing a regime change, kill tens of thousands of people, but we'll get what we want in the end. It's fine. They boast about that. They boast about all the countries that they've forced into democracy, even when the countries weren't even looking for it in the first place. They were just forced to have democracy. Like Afghanistan, which have now ended up under the control of the Taliban. Things like this, it's not worked. The geopolitical strategy of the US, foreign policy-wise, has not worked at all. It's caused in mass murder, hundreds of millions of people since World War II dying unnecessarily because of some geopolitical strategy by the US. And then they boast about it. They boast about all the American military and how strong and powerful they are and how they can do whatever they want.
Exceptional.
China's approach is completely opposite. They're not looking at resources. So what? They talked about Somalia and about lithium. Lithium is the new gold in today's financial trade and in the new kind of marketization of resources.
Yeah.
Lithium is the new gold. That everyone wants lithium, and lithium gets put in batteries. You'd think China, being the sweatshop of the world, would want lithium to run their factories. They have no interest in stealing lithium from Somalia. That's Somalian lithium. America, they've been trying a regime change for ages. China have no interest. They have a completely different worldview, the worldview of Marxism Leninism, with Chinese characteristics. And they don't really care about stealing other people's stuff. They want to help people who don't have what China has. China has become a middle-income country. They're no longer the sweatshop of the world. They are an industrialized, electrified, fully infrastructure-supported country. They're a middle-income country. Wages are rising. The economy is rising. It has since Mao. They haven't receded economically in a long time. Their economy is slowing down recently, but it's still rising at higher rates than the US's. Multipolarity was an inevitable thing. It was always going to happen. If the US can't step up to the plate and can't do what it has done for ages, or continues to fail at it, then other countries are going to have to step up and show other countries options. And like I said, the Solomon Islands, countries like Algeria and Morocco, they're now saying that China and Russia are the future of international politics. And actually, that's a good thing. So they're willing to trade in rubles. They're willing to trade in yen. They're willing to trade in this because they are the future. And that's a very, very good thing. And I very much support that.
I wouldn't say China is completely faultless, though, as they called Ansar Allah terrorists for shooting down a Chinese Predator drone in Yemen. Now, is it not a mistake in this multipolar world to take a position that is much more like the Western imperialist position than, say, an Eastern pole position, be that Russia or China?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Obviously, no one's perfect. I'm not saying China's perfect. There's a lot I don't like, or I'm not comfortable with. And yeah, that was a very childish thing to do, in my opinion. Obviously, whoever made that decision to do it was an expert in his field, and obviously he was a professional. I'm not. I'm just some fucking young guy on online talking about it. But I do think it was quite childish to call them terrorists. I get that maybe China has a patriotic heart to them. And in fact, patriotism is one of their 24 core values. The Chinese Communist Party published their 24 core values, and patriotism is a part of that. So patriotism is a very big part of China. So I think that was what we were seeing when they said that. When they called them, I don't think they were necessarily thinking about humanitarianism when that happened. Chinese citizens did die, and they were just defending kind of their people. It was definitely regrettable, and that isn't the only thing that's happened. China has done, bad things. They have been assholes to certain countries for sure.
I don't think Deng Xiaoping having strong diplomatic relations with General Pinochet was a high point either.
Yeah, true. Yeah, definitely. China has had history with supporting the leader of the Philippines. Even now, they have China have diplomatic ties with the Philippines. Duterte, who's a staunch anti-communist, who actually introduced a law a couple of years ago to order people to grass them up pretty much for being communists. They had ties with Indonesia during the genocide of workers there. And Deng Xiaoping had ties, good positive diplomatic ties with Pinochet, who used to throw trade unionists out of helicopters and send them to camps in the rainforest and starve them to death in camps. The Pinochet death camps have been compared just as bad as the Hitlerite World War II camps. His treatment of communists and workers who wanted better conditions were brutal. Even people who weren't even nearly as close as radical as communists, social democrats, quite liberals, they were sent to death camps under Pinochet. About 45,000 people just wiped out for wanting a fair slice of the pie, as the social democrats would say. Communists don't want a fair slice of the pie. We want to take over the whole fucking bakery. But I mean, Pinochet is a fucking maniac, and I mean, China is not perfect. I support China from an international perspective. And they will be the leader of the new multipolar. I think Russia wants to be. I just don't think they have the infrastructure. I think China is decades ahead technologically to Russia. I support Russia too, but I think China definitely will be the leader of the Eastern multipolar bloc. And it's exciting. It's going to be exciting. But this is why I like politics. It's always changing and shifting, and there's always new stuff coming out every day. And you have to maybe change your opinion on certain things in a matter of days because something new comes out and it's like, shit. So, that's why I like it. It keeps you on your toes. You have to keep yourself updated, and it's really good.
Just one more thing before we conclude. Earlier on National Bolsheviks, I would agree with Lenin and Stalin. Basically, they both gave good reasons as why they viewed National Bolsheviks as enemies of the people. And while Dugin has moved away from that, I see him as the reaction to NATO, as they want to extend the line of defense. Basically, Dugin has spoken of Russian soldiers being in the Arctic and at the same time as dipping their boots in the Indian Ocean. And that requires annexation and military aggression in the style of NATO, I think.
Mm-hmm. What's important to understand about the two different waves of National Bolshevism. The National Bolshevism in Germany in the 1920s was very different to the National Bolshevism of 1990s Russia. In 1920s Germany and the Weimar Republic, Karl Otto Paetel wrote his book in the National the National Bolshevik Manifesto by Karl Otto Paetel. He did say one of the first chapters is vision, and it says the vision, and it talks about columns of black on black, red on red, and grey on grey. And his idea was that one day, under the liberation of Germany, under the Nationalist Bolsheviks party, was that there'd be columns of the red communists, the brown shirts of the Nazi party, and the grey imperial forces from World War I, who wore the silver grey uniforms. And then behind them, the industrial workers, the proletariat, with the hammer, and then behind them, the peasants, the agricultural workers. Those were so he wanted a coalition between the five groups. That was Karl Otto Paetel's idea of National Bolshevism. He wanted a nationalist Germany where the nation was the highest value, and that there was five parts playing a coalition: the communists, the fascists, the imperial forces, so the traditionalists, and then the peasants and the workers. 1990s, that was not the National Bolshevism of Dugin in the 1990s. What happened in the 1990s was that the Soviet Union had just collapsed, and the communists wanted to take back power. from the neoliberal markets. And they thought that the best strategy to do that was to side with the nationalists, the people who supported more Tsarist ideas, who were actually counter-revolutionaries at the start during the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So that was the idea behind the second wave of national Bolshevism under Dugin. It was not really so much siding with fascists and creating a synthesis between communists and fascism. It was more just communist Marxist Leninists siding with more traditionalist kind of Tsarist kind of white army supporting working class people to retake back the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union back at that time was very patriotic. There was a massive patriotism that actually traditionalists had a lot of respect for. So I'm not a national Bolshevik, but I've done a lot of research in it because I've been accused of being one. I've been accused of it all the time. So I actually did research into what it was. And there's very different things. Dugin didn't represent 1920s German national Bolshevism. And even then, Bolshevism can mean something different in different times. I mean, according to Dugin now, in the fourth ideology, all that is, pretty much national Bolshevism is needed because liberalism has failed, communism has failed, and fascism has failed. So we should make a completely new fourth position that just overrides all of that and proceeds, and it's quite modernistic, and it's kind of buys into postmodernism and metaphysics quite a bit. It's very idealist. It's very philosophically, it's very idealist. But so they're all different things. So to call somebody a Nazbol because they said something that you don't like is stupid, because there's so many different variations of National Bolshevism. What one are you talking about? Am I like Karol Otto Patel National Bolshevik, or am I like Dugin? Like what one? Because they're different. Dugin openly has said in the past that he hates Karol Otto Patel because he was a liberal and a degenerate. So they're very different. So like what one? There's such a diverse group of people. So just cut the shit out. Cut the cancel culture. Stop accusing people of shit that they're clearly not because they said something that you don't like. Stop being a child and just take part, like me and Eamon have today, in just an adult, mature conversation. We disagree on Scottish independence, but he educated me on a lot. He said a lot that I didn't know, and I'll take that with me for sure. That's what we're all about here. That's the dialectical method. That's what Marxists should do. I also have another YouTube video on my channel using Mao to fight back against cancel culture, where I quote like 5 quotes and I say that the woke left has absolutely nothing to do with genuine working class socialism. It's a whole facade for them. They just want to hurt working class people, shit on them, and make them feel really bad about themselves for having such bad ideas or wrong ideas. It's absolute nonsense. We have to break and destroy the left-right paradigm that we've been put into by the ruling class, and communists have to break down that paradigm and supersede it. We have to overcome this divide. So there's so much hate and division out there. Just stop. We are communists. We are for the working class people, regardless of who they are. If they're working class people, if they're a part of the labouring classes, we have to support them.
I agree, and I would say the term Nazbol, it's basically a replacement for calling someone red fish or a tanky as a pejorative. It's just lazy, and it's just a way to dodge engaging in the argument that a comrade has made. That's what I believe. And
absolutely,
it's the same thing when they denigrate the Centre for Political Innovation as patriotic socialists. Oh, they're just trying to sanitize National Socialism. I have seen Caleb Maupin. I think Invictus was the nationalist he debated, and Invictus was basically arguing for National Socialism, whereas Caleb was successfully, in my opinion, countering his points, and I'd recommend that everyone watch that debate. It is really interesting and educational.
Is that the guy with is called Cultured Thug? You had the debate with the Cultured Thug.
I'm not sure, but basically,
well, that's another one. If you're unfamiliar with that, Caleb Maupin had a debate with a streamer called Cultured Thug, who's a self-proclaimed fourth positionist, a national socialist. He's an American fascist, pretty much. And Caleb Maupin goes quite hard on him. So there's no excuse for calling Caleb a fascist or whatever. He's not. He's openly, publicly argued against them and won every time. So.
Anyway, is there anything else you'd like to say before I stop recording this?
No, I think I'm all right. I think my previous rant was a perfectly adequate closing statement, so I won't do one.
And that will be all from us. And I hope to have many more discussions with William. And that will be all, folks.
Goodbye.